Book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, Chapter 5. But it's all right. I have an insider. Captain Nelt stared up at his dark tent. He was exhausted from yet another full day of harvesting dusty crops, and he wanted nothing more than to give in to the sleep that was tormenting his eyes. Maybe tonight there wouldn't be a message either. Nothing might ever be coming, but just in case it was, he wanted to be ready. A moment later, a dark body stole into his tent. Nelt propped himself up on his elbows and said to the shadowy figure, "Rather late at night for squirrel hunting, wouldn't you say?" "Depends on how moody the squirrels are," came the response. Although he was relieved to hear the line, and even more pleased to recognize who was delivering it, he scoffed. "Why won't they let me create the codes? Seriously, moody squirrels?" The body sat down next to him with a quiet chuckle. "Because the last time you created a code, half the men were so distracted by it, they couldn't settle down long enough to relate their messages." Nelt grinned. "It was a good one, wasn't it? I still think about her when it's late at night," and the other man cleared his throat. "Sir!" "I told you," said Nelt authoritatively. "You don't have to sir me when we're alone. Only in front of the other men." "Just trying to stay in character. Live it day and night. That's also what you've told me." Nelt smiled into the dark. "Good man. Glad you're listening." "I'm always listening to you, even when I shouldn't be. The way you've twisted my mind, the images you've created—" "You're welcome," Nelt chuckled. "So, what's the news? I expected you 3 days ago. I almost started to worry." "A little storm got in my way, sir, and some mud and trees. But you're all right, I see. So, what's happened to the north?" "Sands is fine," his informant related. "Only about 3 inches of ash, according to the message I received 2 nights ago. Grasses was also in fairly good condition when we left it." "Good," sighed Nelt. "As far as I know, Thorne hasn't heard anything from the west, but is expecting news tomorrow morning. He thought something would come this afternoon." "We know. We're the ones who detained his messengers. They should reach him with the same news tomorrow morning. We wanted to make sure we got here first." The messenger slipped something to Nelt, and the captain fingered it in the dark. "Feels perfect," said Nelt. "How are the trials?" "Excellent. We've distilled it significantly." A small vial was passed. "Good, good. Subtlety is everything." The messenger chuckled. "Ironic statement coming from you." Nelt smirked. "When everyone expects the outrageous from you, they never suspect the subtle. Act as the opposite of what you are. Remember that. You may need to play that part as well someday." "So I need to play the idiot to cover up my genius?" "No, you've always been an idiot, little brother. You need to start acting smart." Nelt ducked automatically, knowing his brother would swing for his head when insulted. The captain stifled a snort as his brother hit only air. "You're getting quicker at that, Captain. Good dodge." "It's only because you're predictable, little brother. Never do the same thing twice. If you leave a pattern, you'll be discovered." "Oof!" "Like that?" his brother asked smugly. "Didn't expect that punch to the gut now, did you?" "Oh, yes, just like that," Nelt gasped. "I have hope for you yet. Slag, if that leaves a mark—" "How could it? Besides, I learned from you to never leave marks." Nelt grumbled in approval. So what's the news? Is Jordan still coming? Under what pretext?" "To bring his general assistance, of course," the younger Nelt said with feigned enthusiasm. "What greater devotion can Major Jordan demonstrate than by bringing reinforcements and supplies?" "Good, good," Nelt said. Tell Jordan we have about 14 of our contacts." "Only 14? We had nearly 100 when you left." Nelt sighed. "I found many of their bodies in the mud. The rest are corpses washing out to the southern sea by now." His brother cringed. "Is it enough?" "It has to be. There are still 6 on the other side." "Only 6? But it can still work, according to the message I received when I was harvesting a field not far from the border. Thorn's still playing at something. He's agreed to send everyone back to their forts, but I have a feeling he won't go until he has it out with Sargon first. That's when we'll act. But it's all right. I have an insider." "Captain Lick?" Nelt scoffed. "Huh, he's on his way out, as are his little helpers. I've seen only 2 left, surgeon's assistants, it seems. He's not going to be a problem. No, my insider's about to become Thorn's son." "What?" Nelt explained the situation, and when he finished, his brother shook his head. "And we're sure he's not with Lick. He's too innocent to be with anyone. He's trusting and smart, but also hopelessly naive. He's my little buddy. Whatever Thorn is going to do, he'll tell Shin, then Shin will tell me. We have a good chance at succeeding at this." "If you pull this off, you'll be Major Nelt by the end of next week." Nelt smiled but gripped his brother's arm. "One more thing. Get the word out. Tell Jordan and the rest to steer clear of Shin. He's a good boy, and we could use him. I'd hate to see him go down." "I can't make promises. Everyone around Thorn is a target. You know that. He shields himself with other people's bodies. The only way to reach him is to take out his protection." I know, Nelt said. "And Shin's hard to miss. He'll be the biggest thing out there. Tall, black hair, dark eyes, bulky, a corporal. Just tell them to try to miss him." His brother sighed. "Ugh, might as well ask Thorn to surrender to Jordan instead." "It will work," Nelt said firmly. "And," he added, "if something goes wrong, keep an eye on Shin for me, will you? He doesn't belong here." "Where does he belong, then?" his brother probed. "I'm not sure yet. Just not at the side of Thorn. Promise me?" "Of course, but what will I do with him? Sounds like he's too big to be my pet." "I'm not sure what you should do with him," Nelt admitted. "But in time it may be obvious. Just keep your eyes open for him." The next morning, on the 62nd day, Shin woke up feeling hopeful. Yesterday, Thorn had agreed to harvest more crops, and when news came that farms on the way to coast were requesting help, Shin was sure that Thorn would agree to one more day of working before heading north to Edge. As he washed his face and dressed, he felt like he was succeeding. Still, he was concerned that each time he asked the general when they were returning to Province 8, Thorn responded with, "When the time's right, son. Soon." His hopeful feeling was pushed aside by the nagging one that Thorn wasn't telling him everything. As Shin made his way to the officers' eating room, he saw a lone figure hunched over a book. "Corporal, you're up early again," said Colonel Glasser. "Yes, sir. I didn't mean to disturb your reading, sir." "Not at all, not at all." Glasser motioned to the chair across from him. "I was hoping I'd see you this morning. Here, read this." He slid the book across to Shin, who sat down. "What is this, sir?" "What I was looking for," said Glasser quietly. "And I found it. The writings, right here about the waking of Mount Deceit. I think it might be a sign, don't you? And here," he pointed to a passage. Shin swallowed hard. The style of printing was different, and the book was considerably thinner than the family version they had in Salem. but the words were familiar, mostly. Before the last day, Mount Deceit will awaken. Before the last day, my chosen will strike terror in the deadened hearts of the fiercest soldiers. Before the last day, those who have no power shall discover the greatest power is all around them. Before the last day, those who stay true will be delivered to peace from destruction. I have created this time. I have given these warnings, and I will reward my faithful children. Shin's eyebrows furrowed. Something was missing or written incorrectly. He knew in the version they had in Salem that Mount Deceit was called the tallest mountain. This was Guide Hiram's prophecy, given only 6 years after the first 500 families were placed here by the Creator. Deceit wasn't named until nearly 200 years later. And where were the names Deliverer and Destroyer? In the Salem version, they were capitalized, as if denoting individuals. And my chosen will strike terror. He knew that wasn't right. There was never someone who was chosen, was there? In Salem, the phrase was something bordering on the laughable. Even the aged, not my chosen. Perhaps someone had rewritten this, had taken liberties with the wording. Then again, he didn't seem to recall anything accurately anymore. Maybe he was just remembering incorrectly. Right here, Glasser whispered as he pointed to my chosen. And look here, delivered to peace from destruction. Shin, I'd never admit this to anyone else, but I think it's referring to you. Shin was already shaking his head. No, see, I'm pretty sure that's not right, because what do you know of destiny, Shin? He looked up. Destiny, sir? He was only vaguely familiar with the term. I believe there are things we could do, but it's up to us to actually choose to do them. Glasser smiled. Shin, you could bring great peace to Idumea. You might be able to fulfill this prophecy. Disbelieving and baffled, he said, Sir, how? The colonel glanced around again. I have a spy in Sargon's camp, he whispered. He's told me that Sargon's scared, ill-prepared, and vulnerable. He's willing to listen to a compromise from Thorn, but Thorn has to deliver it himself. If we could get the two of them together to discuss the tragedy that's hit both of our territories, we could forge a lasting peace. Think of it, Shin. A unified, peaceful world just like your grandfather and great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather had. You might be able to do this, Shin. It's in your blood, and it's your destiny. Glasser's words bounced around in Shin's mind, smashing anything that could have interfered with the notion that he was not the chosen one, which a few moments ago he didn't even know existed. It was intoxicating, intriguing, and incredible. He did come to the world to do great things, didn't he? All you have to do is talk to Thorn and get him to agree to a meeting. Tell him he needs to face Sargon so that he can appreciate the caliber and strength of a man like Thorn. Then Sargon will yield to his proposals. It's all in your hands, Shin. He'll do anything for his son. I already heard him say that. Shin was already nodding halfway through Glasser's plea. Consider it done, sir. When should the meeting take place? Glasser leaned back. How about this evening, after the rest of the crops are brought in? Save the people from starvation first, then save them from a bloody end next. Well, Colonel Ferrum whispered to Colonel Glasser as the two men sauntered to the stables half an hour later. He's the chosen one, Jurgis. I could see it in his eyes as I planted the idea. Very fertile soil, that boy is. Too bad he's not going to live to see the fruits of our efforts. Maybe we'll have to name something in his memory in Idumea as a thank you. Ferrum chuckled quietly. Captain Lick paced the command office, waiting for Thorn, who was slow to return from breakfast. Lick suspected it had to do with a certain corporal who caught the general and asked for a few minutes. Shin was going to ruin everything, especially if he was from Salem. Lick had been anxious to speak to Onus about the mountains behind Edge. The path through the boulders was there somewhere, and someone should have found it by now. But was that someone still alive? Depending on where Salem was, it might be under deceit, too. The only way Lick could find out was if he had an army. But his own offensive, along with the majority of his men, had been blown to pieces by the volcano's eruption, leaving him with only 2 associates and fragments of his plans. Yet all he needed was one success, one sure victory to seal the deal with Thorn. In many ways, the explosion was fortunate. Supposedly Salem had huge buildings filled with food and supplies. It might not be so difficult now to convince Thorn that they needed to go north, or northeast, or northwest. His father was never quite sure. Then again, his father didn't have much grasp of reality during his last bitter years. Lick's pacing turned to stomping. He had to eliminate Shin. He stood in the way. But it had to look like an accident. Maybe Lick could be defending Shin somehow, trying to help save him when the poor corporal met his demise. Then again, one of Lick's men was particularly skilled, and perhaps Lick could suggest that he find his way to Shin, and... The door flew open, and General Thorn marched into the office. "General, sir, have a good breakfast." Lick stood at attention. "Sure, Lick, breakfast was just lovely," Thorn said with a sneer. "What are you doing here already?" "We were to meet this morning, remember, sir, to discuss the border meeting?" Lick knew not to point out that Thorn was half an hour late. "That's right," Thorn said, shuffling some papers on the desk as he sat down. "I just came from a discussion about that." "You have, sir," he tried to say brightly, attempting to hide his anger that he, the chosen battle commander based on his plan submitted to Thorn many moons ago, had been left out of the discussion about the very battle he had planned. "With the colonels?" Thorn glanced up again. "With those of influence, yes. It will happen this evening." "This evening, sir. Are we prepared?" "For negotiations, yes," Thorn said, picking up a paper and scanning it. He ignored Lick's gasp of surprise. "Sir, do you mean actual negotiations or," Lick leered, "negotiations?" "Negotiations are negotiations, Lick," Thorn said dismissively. "I'll be prepared with all of my soldiers, and I just received word that Jordan is coming from the west with 500 men and horses, fresh and ready to help at the border." Lick wasn't expecting that. "Jordan, sir? On his way here?" "So I was told by my messengers. Seems the West is in fairly good condition and can reestablish supply lines should we need them." "So it's negotiations," Lick smiled, "where General Thorn is victorious once again in reuniting the world." Thorn sighed. "Just what do you want, Captain?" Lick resumed his stance. "To know how to best serve, sir. Your success is my greatest concern. I have a variety of scenarios for you to choose from. This is what I was selected for, correct? To stay next to you and provide strategies? So what will you have me do this evening, sir?" "You, Captain, may stand next to me as I engage in negotiations with Sargon," said Thorn crisply. "You may learn by my side how to win over the enemy for the common good of the world." These were strange words coming from the general. Common good was never part of any strategy they discussed. Of course, sir. I look forward to it. Do we know with what forces General Sargon may arrive? Doesn't matter as long as we arrive with more, Thorne said meaningfully. Tell the soldiers who are finishing harvesting that they best not overexert themselves. We have a meeting this evening. Lick nearly burst with anticipation. So it is negotiations, sir. He couldn't understand why Thorne regarded him with such a strained expression, but he nodded officiously. On my way to the men, sir. Captain Nelt stood at the main gates watching as Corporal Shin handed out assignments to the soldiers heading out to the harvest. Such a tragic loss, he thought. So much potential. So many rhymes not yet completed. Nelt glanced instinctively to the west. No horses were yet seen kicking up clouds of dust, and Nelt regretted that he wouldn't be there when they rode in. If he could spare half a minute to speak to Jordan, to find out when to draw Shin away. The chipper corporal jogged over. Told you I was on top of it, Captain. Another day of harvesting. What do you think about that? I still think you're pushing your luck, Shin, Nelt sighed. Especially with what's coming tonight. Shin waved that off. It's just negotiations, Captain. We're going to achieve a lasting peace with Sargon. Nelt almost scoffed. So you're not in the least bit upset you won't get to bloody that sword of yours? He seemed jolted by that. That hasn't seemed so important lately, sir, he confessed quietly. All I want to do is go back to Edge. Nelt almost smiled. Despite his outward confidence, this was just an overly large boy, flailing and drowning in a very deep pool. All he wanted to do was go home where it was safe. I have a better idea, Nelt said. Come with me to Sands instead. News is good out of there. There's very little ash, lots of food in the storehouses. Apparently General Jordan believed in keeping those stocked. And I could finish your song and create a few more for you. Shin shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I really need to get back to Province 8. The general's expecting it. Nelt gripped Shin's arm. Don't do it. Don't go with him, especially tonight. When you ride next to him, you're the biggest target. Stay back with me. Let me introduce you to Jordan. Start discussing your transfer. Shin pulled his arm out of Nelt's grasp. Captain, no. I thank you for your concern, but I have greater things to do tonight. Don't deny my destiny. The boy was flailing dangerously because he was irrepressibly stupid. You're what? Shin sighed. Just be there to watch, Captain. You'll be impressed, I'm sure. Nelt groaned. Oh, why are you so obsessed with impressing people? You should be worried about staying alive. Come with me. I thank you again for your assistance in the past, he said formally. I need no more assistance from you now, sir. Shin really believed it, too. Just when he needed the help the most, he didn't want any at all. I'm really going to miss you, boy, Nelt said sadly. We could have had a lot of fun together. I'll see you on the other side. He turned and walked away. Glasser stood outside the fort walls waiting for the messenger he sent to the border. The man carrying the purple-striped banner of truce was riding back with his escort of 10 soldiers, and he stopped in front of the colonel. I met with Captain Glasser, sir. General Sargon has agreed to the meeting. The captain said everyone will be in place an hour before sundown. Glasser nodded to the messenger and walked back to the fort. Colonel Ferrum met him at the gates. Well, which mansion do you want? Glasser whispered. The old High General's or the rebuilt old chairman's. As much as Corporal Shin wanted to join the soldiers harvesting, he knew General Thorne wouldn't want him anywhere else than by his side. In fact, Captain Lick retrieved him, wearing an oddly earnest smile. "The captain's waiting for you, Shin. He wanted to discuss the steps of negotiation with you. I will bring you to him." Anxious about spending any time near Lick, Shin fell in line behind him. "Thanks, sir, but I know the way to the command office." Lick smiled as if he'd had too much sugar that morning. "Well, of course you do. You know, I think we got off on the wrong foot. I've been a little sharp with everyone lately, and word's gotten around that I'm not too happy about things. But I assure you that's not true. You see, this is my first major offensive, and I really want to do well, as I know you do. Lots of pressure, isn't there?" He nudged the corporal in a brotherly way. Yes, sir," seemed the safest answer. "We just don't want to disappoint our general, do we? Quite an honor for us to be at his side this evening. You and I are his first choices, so let's make sure we please him. All right, Corporal?" "Yes, sir. So how do we please him?" Lick grinned broadly. "I'm glad you asked that. You please him by doing exactly what he says. But I also know that Thorne enjoys taking the glory for himself, as he rightly deserves to do. So, when he steps forward to shake Sargon's hand, take a few steps back. Let him be the center of attention. Behind the general will be a row of officers, surgeons, and their assistants. Since you don't belong among the officers, step back between the surgeon's assistants. Thorne may gesture for you to join him, but don't move unless he does. Understand?" Shin nodded. "Of course, sir. Let him take the glory and stand with the surgeon's assistants. I wouldn't have it any other way." Later that day, General Thorne stood outside the gates watching as the plume of ash approached from the west. Corporal Shin hung back as usual, hoping that Sargon's soldiers, who were massing a mile to the south, would realize reinforcements were coming, 500 strong. Major Jordan was appropriately up front with the soldiers and saluted as he reined his horse to a stop. His gaze automatically shifted past Thorne to Shin, and the corporal instinctively looked down. "Jordan," Thorne called, drawing the major's attention back. "You made good time, I see. Get your men in for an early dinner. We have a great deal to discuss and much to prepare for tonight." "Of course, General," Jordan said, dismounting and handing the reins of his horse to a lieutenant. "I didn't realize you had plans for this evening. I hope it'll be satisfactory for everyone here," he asked as he approached the general to shake his left hand. "Indeed it will be. Follow me. Let's get you briefed." And he turned for the command office. But Jordan couldn't take his eyes off of Shin. "Corporal, have we met before? You look strangely familiar." Thorne spun to see the exchange. Shin looked up and gulped. Yes, sir, we have. You recruited me before you took over the fort at Sands almost a year ago. I was coming out of a fog. You got me peach pie?" Jordan tapped his lips. Yes, I suppose that could be it. Interesting name choice there, Shin. I met the original when I was about 11 or 12. It was at his daughter's wedding in Mount Scene. "Major," Thorne said sharply, "we can discuss that later. Come now. We have little time left." Jordan stood taller as he faced Thorne. "Of course, sir." But he dropped his voice and said to Shin as they followed the general, "Come, Corporal. He doesn't like reminders about a wedding he thought was supposed to be his." There was a quiet snigger. "Nor do we want to keep our brave general waiting, do we?" Captain Nelt exchanged the briefest of looks with Major Jordan at dinner. He didn't have to communicate what Shin looked like, because Jordan was walking with the corporal. But Jordan did raise his chin to knelt as he passed. Jordan was ready, as were all who were with him. Colonel Glasser looked over the mass of men gulping down their dinners, and he silently counted. All that he expected were there. Ferrum had his numbers, too. All who were with them were ready. Captain Lick surveyed the soldiers as they filed out to the compound onto their short march to the southern border, their faces sober and determined. He caught the eyes of his men on either side of the battle surgeon. All who were with him were ready. Corporal Shin swallowed, then swallowed again. Atop the large black Clark cousin, he had a view of the entire army and the scene of gray before him, which meant those he was approaching had a clear view of him. He didn't feel ready, not one bit. A few times he tried to slow the gait of his horse to position himself behind General Thorne, but each time Thorne glanced back. "By my side, son. Ready and on my left." On the right side of Thorne, Captain Lick nodded once to remind Shin to keep the general happy. So Shin clucked his horse and stared straight ahead, pretending he knew what ready meant. It wasn't hard to know when they approached the border. The sweeping gray before them formed dark shapes in the distance. Sargon's army waiting. General Thorne had purposely left late, he told Shin, to remind Sargon whose party this really was. Shin bit his lower lip as he assessed how far the dark line of uniforms and horses extended. At least half a mile, maybe more. He wondered just how trustworthy Glasser's spy was. If this was Sargon at unprepared, he shuddered to think what organized and angry may have looked like. As the line of soldiers came into view, Thorne turned in his saddle, nodded to Glasser and Ferrum riding behind, and the two colonels shouted orders to the men marching behind. Shin twisted in his saddle to watch the soldiers, 800 on horses and 6,000 on foot, spread apart in a great wide line themselves, 3 men deep. The mass of men fanning out in an endless stream was impressive to Shin, but it wasn't a lonely corporal who needed intimidating. He took a bracing breath and turned to see the enemy looming even larger in front of him. Thorne directed his horse to the banners waving in the distance, signaling the presence of General Sargon, now barely 100 paces away. Thorne signaled to a lieutenant colonel along the row of officers who rode behind them, and the man waved to 20 soldiers on horseback. As one body, the soldiers kicked their mounts and rode to Thorne and his accompaniment, to form a wall of soldiers and horses before Thorne, Lick, and Shin. Even with the buffer, Shin still felt exposed as he focused on the enemy before him. They wore blue uniforms as well, a slightly darker shade, with red bands on the sleeves. At 50 paces away, the men looked larger than anyone Shin had ever faced. Eltana Jordan had been hopelessly wrong to claim that the soldiers in Idumea were flabby, weak things. Shin's stomach twisted, and he wondered for the 100th time why he thought this was going to be a fantastic experience. Although he knew it was his imagination, he was sure that every last soldier was staring at him, their hands hovering near their swords. A row of bowmen, dozens of paces behind General Sargon, also seemed to be eyeing him. That didn't seem fair. Thorne had lost all his bowmen, as well as the building that stored extra weapons to the advancing mudslide. Shin squinted to see if the bows the soldiers held were caked in mud, but he couldn't tell. What he really wanted to do was to make sure the 2 rows of remaining officers, as well as the battle surgeon, were still behind him. But he also knew that he was supposed to maintain eye contact with Sargon. Thorne had made that very clear before dinner, as he drilled into him the principles of intimidation, negotiation, and retaliation. Any twitch, any turn, any movement that betrayed a lack of complete control could be detrimental to Thorn's show of absolute strength. Not one man riding with Thorn should back down or cower under the gaze of General Sargon and his rows of officers, now a mere 20 paces away. The soldiers in front of Thorn stopped, and the entire corps of soldiers halted as well, lined up on either side of General Thorn, as far as the eye could see. Each soldier began his own staring contest with the man across the border from him. Thorn nudged his horse to slip between his guard, allowing himself to be the foremost before his army. Lick followed, as did Shin's horse, as if knowing it was supposed to remain next to Thorn in the most exposed and open position possible. Shin held his breath as the men up and down the lines glared at each other in unnerving silence. Apparently this is how it was played, to see who'd breach the stillness first. It struck Shin as childish, and as the silence continued, he imagined himself breaking the tension by blurting, "So, quite an odd patch of weather we've been having, eh?" But fortunately nerves made him bite his tongue. From the corner of his eye he noticed that General Thorn remained completely still. As Shin imagined the stony glare the general must have been using on Sargon, he wished he could feel such a sense of control. Instead, he looked across to General Sargon mounted on his horse. He was shorter than Shin expected, and his bald head was covered by a cap with a shining eagle on the front. While the man wasn't as handsomely commanding as Thorn, he was compact, muscular, and intimidating in his own way. His brown eyes were just as hard as Thorn's blue ones, and Shin thought for a moment that he was watching each man in front of him simultaneously. Sargon, too, didn't want to be the first to speak as he glared back at Thorn. Finally, a captain on foot from Sargon's side walked to the space between the two generals. He cleared his throat as he faced Thorn about 5 paces away from his mount. "General Sargon welcomes General Thorn to the border and demands to know what concessions Thorn is willing to make in order to ensure a lasting peace between our two factions." Another voice, shouting from the left of Shin, answered, "Captain Glasser, this show of mercy was pleaded for by Sargon," Colonel Glasser called. "It's his obligation to lay at General Thorn's feet his requests for leniency." The captain straightened his back to shout his response, his eyes fixed on General Thorn. "It was our understanding, Colonel, that this meeting was to benefit both sides. We were led to believe General Thorn was wise enough to recognize this mutual disruption to both our forces, that attention now should be on alleviating the suffering of our people before we decided whose government was the most powerful in the world." Shin sat in rigid dread. This didn't sound right, and hardly seemed like a prelude to peace. He had no idea what he could do to fix it. No one had been whispering in his ear for a while. A gentle chuckling caught Shin's attention. It was an odd sound for such a dramatic moment. He turned to see Thorn, amused. "Come, come, Sargon," he called out with surprising geniality. "We don't need a Glasser family argument to take over our negotiations, do we? Captain," he said, looking down at the younger, livid man, "step back. Your father's armed and he's been in a foul mood lately. He may do something he'll later regret." The captain's mouth dropped open, and he pivoted to Sargon. But Sargon was watching Thorn intently. "I do believe you're right, Thorn," he said in a measured tone. "No need for the Glassers to escalate in our behalf. Captain, you may step back." Astonished, Captain Glasser stumbled backward 2 steps. His eyes darted to his father and then back to Thorn. "So, Sargon," Thorn called over as if hailing his best friend, "tell me, how's the most beautiful city in the world faring? I hope the garrison's still intact?" Sargon nodded once. "It is in excellent condition." "Good, good," Thorn nodded back pleasantly. "And how about the University of Idumea, home of some of my fondest memories?" Sargon nodded again, tipping his head as if trying to work out Thorn's strange cordiality. A little ashy, but soon swept away. Classes will resume on schedule. Excellent, excellent. And one more question. The condition of the old High General's mansion. I spent a great deal of gold restoring it to its former glory. How fares it today? Sargon smiled, willing to play along. As magnificent as ever. One of my women and her children especially enjoy the furnishings. My other woman and our sons live with me in the old chairman's mansion which you rebuilt, also still in pristine condition. Wonderful, wonderful, Thorn said in approval. He glanced over at Shin. Doesn't sound like too much cleanup is necessary. Shin's lips parted in worry. Thorn turned back to Sargon. But then again, the university and the garrison were on the banks high above the river. So, Sargon, how's my beloved Idumea along the rivers? Sargon's eyes clouded. About the same as pools, I imagine. The citizens are gathering in whatever crops remain while finding new sources of water. We've lost both the west and east forks of the Idumean River. Of greatest concern is to secure the safety and future welfare of our citizens. Thorn nodded once. Of course, and I concur. The wisest course of action is to ensure our world survives this disaster. Therefore, I have a proposal. Corporal Shin began to breathe easier. This sounded more like what Thorn had discussed with him an hour earlier. To maintain security while we clean up, I propose that we cease all questions as to whose governing ability is superior until the world is stabilized. Sargon narrowed his eyes. And what kind of assurance will I have that you will not break this cessation prematurely? Thorn smiled thinly. I have too much at stake in Idumea. He nodded to his left. You have yet to meet my son, Lek Thorn. Corporal Shin froze. He no longer knew how to breathe, especially with thousands of pairs of eyes trained on him. Your son? Sargon snickered. He looks a little old to be one of your sons. And from what I can see, his label says Shin. I thought you gave up chasing after Shins years ago. I did, Thorn said easily. He found me. General Sargon, may I present the grandson of Colonel Perrin Shin and the son of Jatsi Brider. He was abandoned in the forest where his mother was killed, then hidden by those who thought they were his uncle and aunt, the Briders, for 25 years. But now he's found his way back to me, his true father. Shin wasn't sure how many men gasped because it was drowned out by his own desperation to breathe again. It was out, everything, even the suggestion that Lemuel Thorn was his real father. The corporal's stomach traded places with his heart. Sargon stared at him, looking for the resemblance. Suddenly his eyes flared in recognition. Congratulations, Thorn, Sargon said with an odd smile as he recuperated from the surprise. I never knew you had it in you. Although I must point out he looks nothing like you. Thorn shook his head reprovingly. Now, Sargon, your daughters look nothing like you either, much to their relief, I'm sure. Ignoring the scattered sniggers, Thorn continued. My son Lek is why I'm determined to make sure Idumea not only survives, but thrives. You see, I've promised him a University of Idumea education. I want my only son to complete command school as I did, and know the privilege of living in the mansion of his ancestors. And how are you proposing to accomplish this? Sargon asked guardedly, seeing as I currently hold all you profess to love. By handing you the last thing I love, General Sargon, I will give you my son Lek Thorn. Corporal Shin felt as if somebody had punched him in the gut, and he gripped the horn of his saddle to keep from tipping over. Given? To General Sargon? How could someone just give another person away? He wasn't even Thorn's to give. Or was he just claimed? There certainly were more than 20 people around. Wasn't he supposed to accept the claiming? He was given a name, too, wasn't he? Lek Thorn? Shin looked around wildly, hoping someone could explain what was happening, but his eyes rested on Sargon, who was smirking. Perhaps you should have warned your son, Thorn. He seems a little surprised by your offer. Shin immediately tensed, trying to look less like a terrified boy and more like a hardened soldier. He knew he was failing. But Thorn chuckled easily. He's just worried he has to clean up in Idemia. He never did enjoy cleaning up other people's messes. Sargon, I give you my son as a token of my honor and promise to leave Idemia alone. In return, I expect you to make sure he's housed in the gold bedroom of the High General's mansion and is enrolled in command school. Sargon nodded. Sounds surprisingly reasonable. Reasonable? Shin thought hysterically. What if anything of this sounded reasonable? But Thorn, Sargon continued, I want your son's assurances that he'll behave appropriately at all times, especially in light of the fact that I have 2 teenage daughters who also live in the mansion. Shin's gut took another hit. He could see exactly what Thorn had in mind, and it made him nauseated. Thorn cocked his head innocently. Are they that old now? My, how time flies. I'm certain my son will behave as I expect him to. Now, in exchange for giving you a son, I want another in return. Sargon's eyebrows went up. Thorn, I'm sure you know my 2 boys are still quite young. Neither of them is ready to... I don't want your sons. I prefer them already raised and trained. No, Sargon, I want that one. He pointed to the soldier standing in front of him. Give me Captain Glasser. I believe his father has been without his company for too long. No! Captain Glasser shouted. No, I won't go! He spun to Sargon. Sir, don't make me leave your side! Sargon tipped his head thoughtfully. Thorn, once again, is proving to be quite insightful today, and I agree with him. He sneered as he said, Glasser, you and your father need to be together again. To Thorn he said, Glasser's yours, while Lek is mine. Colonel Glasser bellowed from his horse. I don't want him. Thorn, he's a traitor. Why do you want a traitor in your midst? Thorn looked over at him. Indeed, why would I? He answered coolly. I have so many already, don't I? Colonel Glasser didn't flinch, but stared at Thorn. Yes, you do. One by the name of Captain Lick. Captain Lick flinched in his position next to Thorn and straightened up. Sir, it's a lie. I'm completely devoted to you. Thorn smiled smoothly at Captain Lick. Yes, you are. But you're not devoted to my son. With one swift movement, Thorn drew his sword and thrust it into Lick's chest, to the shouts and cries of his men and the soldiers across the border. But, General, Lick gasped. Salem! He fell from his horse in a lifeless heap on the ground. Shin slapped his hand over his mouth to keep from retching. He didn't know what was more alarming, the swiftness with which Thorn had killed Lick, or the fact that his last word was Salem. Someone here knew. His stomach heaved, but he fought against it. Again, why did he think this would be a fantastic experience? Thorn gestured calmly to Captain Glasser. There's your new horse, Captain. Take Lick's sword before you mount. You can wear 2 for the time being. Stunned, Captain Glasser only stared at the still body of Lick. Go on, Sargon commanded him. As if kicked from behind, Glasser took a few stumbling steps toward the open space between the 2 armies. He crouched when he reached Lick's body and, with a shaking hand, pulled the sword from the sheath. He stared at it before looking up at Thorn. Don't even think about it, boy, he hissed. The captain's chest heaved, and he wet his lips nervously. Glasser! Another stern voice barked. Colonel Ferrum. "Captain, take your place next to General Thorne, now!" The captain glanced at Ferrum before he mounted the horse where he held Lick's sword limply across his lap. Sargon nodded in satisfaction. "Now give me the newest addition to my household, Thorne." Corporal Shin could hardly breathe as he turned to General Thorne. "Sir, you really mean this?" Thorne smiled pleasantly. "You'll love Idemia. The entertainments at the arena are unsurpassed. I'll write to you frequently, and I expect you to do the same. And I expect you to honor the daughters of General Sargon as they deserve to be honored." Thorne gave Shin a quick wink that no one in Sargon's camp could have seen. Shin's belly churned with new nausea at the implication. "Go now. Take your position by that major over there." He pointed with the bloodied sword to an officer who blanched. "I'm sure he'll slide his mount over to make room for you, and keep the horse. Not like I was about to return it to the stables at Pools anyway." Corporal Shin didn't know what else to do but nudge his horse to walk across the open space to the other side. His mind screamed, "No, no, no!" but he knew the words coming out of his mouth would be pathetic. Every man watched him take the short ride. Maybe this was what was needed to ensure peace. Maybe the chosen one was to sacrifice himself. Two officers on the side of Sargon reluctantly shifted their horses to make room for Shin, forcing several soldiers to slide down and rearrange the line. His chest was heavy and hot as he reached the other side and turned his horse around to face General Thorne. That's when he saw the row of officers behind Thorne. They wore expressions that reflected his own: shock, amazement, dismay. And on the face of Captain Nelt, immense pity. He shook his head almost imperceptibly. There was nothing more Nelt could do to help him. He'd be lost to the other side not knowing a single soul in the world, not knowing any way to get back home. "Welcome to Idemia, Lek," Sargon called down tonelessly. Shin nodded back once and gulped. "Do we have any other business, Sargon?" Thorne asked breezily. Sargon shook his head. "Not that I see. I'm satisfied. And you?" "Sirs," Colonel Ferrum spoke up, "I believe all of us on both sides would feel more at ease with the arrangement if the two of you clasped hands in agreement, if only for the sake of the two sons exchanged." Ferrum nodded at Corporal Shin, who was beginning to turn as gray as the ash around him. Thorne sent Shin a reassuring smile. "I have full confidence Sargon will take great care of my son. As I promise, no vengeance will visit Captain Glasser for abandoning our side a year ago. But as a gesture of goodwill—" Thorne replaced his sword, dismounted from his horse, and took 3 steps to the empty space between the armies. Sargon, not to be outdone by the gestures of peace, dismounted as well. "Your son will enjoy the very best of Idemia, as I'm sure Captain Glasser will enjoy getting reacquainted with his father," Sargon said as he began to walk toward Thorne. Instead of watching the generals, Shin found his attention drawn to Jordan with Nelt by his side. Jordan made an odd eye twitch, followed by a quick nose scratch. An officer within Shin's peripheral view scratched his nose too. Shin gasped. Codes. These were facial codes, like Pugga and Uncle Shem's. A soldier standing next to Shin's horse made a jerky movement with his arm, his hand going into his jacket. Another soldier on horseback, part of Thorne's buffer, flicked his foot in an odd manner. It was happening too fast. Shin could see what was coming but didn't know how to stop it except to shout, "Sirs!" But he was too late. As the generals clasped left hands, something shot out from the vicinity of Shin's boot and streaked to the generals. "No!" Shin cried, and kicked the soldier whose hand was in his jacket. Another muffled noise like a thwack came from the man's uniform as he fell to his knees from the blow. On the other side of the border, an officer fell from his mount. Colonel Glasser hit the ground, clutching his shoulder where something small and pointed was protruding from it. "Father!" Captain Glasser cried as he jumped from his horse and rushed to his father's side. But everyone was watching Thorn, who was shouting, "Who did that?" as he tried to hold up a collapsing General Sargon with his one good arm. Sargon had slumped to his knees, a small object jutting from his back. Two of Sargon's officers hurriedly dismounted to rush to their general's aid. "You!" Thorn shouted at the officer by Shin, who was clutching the arm that Shin had kicked. "You've shot your own general! Betrayers, get him!" Suddenly Thorn gasped and recoiled from a blow that must have come from behind. "I'm hit!" "It was him!" the officer next to Shin shouted, pointing to Jordan. "He called for the shot." "Liar!" Jordan roared back, drawing his sword. "No, no, no!" Shin cried, and spurred his horse to the middle of the open space. "Stop! We can't come to blows now! Not when we're so close to peace! Sir!" he called down to Thorn, who was breathing heavily. His battle surgeon was already at the scene, and one of Thorn's surgeon's assistants rushed to the aid of General Sargon, laying him down and hovering protectively over him. Now nearly all of the soldiers had unsheathed their swords and were watching intently to see what would happen to the generals gasping in pain on the border. Shin watched with growing panic as the surgeon examined the short arrow sticking out of Thorn's back. "Hold on, General," the surgeon said. Then with a mighty yank he pulled out the stubby arrow. Thorn cried out in pain as the surgeon supported him. "What is it?" he demanded. "Where did it come from? Who is the target?" But the surgeon's assistant, frantically working on Sargon, cut him off. "General! Sir! Sir!" He slapped Sargon, who appeared unconscious. "What did you do to him?" shouted one of Sargon's men. "Nothing! Trying to help him breathe. He just... General!" The surgeon lunged and gripped Sargon's throat, searching for a pulse. Corporal Shin knew it wasn't good. He also knew he and his horse stood right in the middle of whatever was about to come next. The surgeon sighed. And stood up. "He's dead," he announced. "Who's second in—" No one heard the end of his sentence. 10,000 men with swords unsheathed had been waiting for the word, any word. Terrified, Shin kicked his horse and rode between the soldiers, rushing each other at the border. Only once he was sure he was far enough away did he rein his horse to a stop and turn to see what to do next. But the bloody horror he faced paralyzed him. Already dozens of men were on the ground, and deafening shouts rose up as hundreds more slashed and swiped and raged at each other. But worst of all, Shin was on the wrong side, in Sargon's territory. He searched the other side and spotted Nelt, mounted and shouting to soldiers. Somehow Nelt caught Shin's eye, as if he'd been looking for him, and waved for him to join him. Not seeing an available opening in the melee, the corporal whipped his horse around and headed west, along the line, until he came to the bulk of soldiers who, interestingly, only watched the battle. About 100 paces from the fallen generals on either side, soldiers were fighting fiercely. But beyond that, the men held their swords uncertainly, tossing glances at their enemies but not eager to engage them. It was through those anxious soldiers that Shin rode his horse. They didn't even notice him forcing his animal between, too engrossed in watching the violent show as if it were at the arena. A glance at the battle explained why the rest of the soldiers weren't joining in. Men with red armbands slashed at others with red armbands, and men with yellow trim battled those in yellow. Captain Glasser was dragging his limp father out of the commotion, while Colonel Ferrum suddenly cut down one of his own lieutenants, to Shin's astonishment. Who was on whose side wasn't clear, nor did it seem smart to engage before knowing which side may be victorious. Shin spurred his horse to follow after Nelt, who was heading north out of the fray. Nelt slowed down his mount to allow Shin to catch up, and they stopped their horses only once they were well away from the wildly swinging blades. "Captain, what's happening?" Shin was nearly hysterical. "I don't understand anything." But Nelt was calm as he surveyed the battle. "Thorn's not a man with a lot of friends, Shin," he said, his eyes darting as if trying to locate particular individuals. "Nor does Sargon have an enemy entirely devoted to him. Although his death is likely the responsibility of our side, he added in a mutter, although no one was near to hear. What do you mean? Shin asked. That small arrow, that didn't kill him. Our surgeon's assistant had some substance embedded in his sleeve. I'm guessing it's a distilled and lethal version of sedation. Rub it into someone's nose and they'll never wake up again. And hovering over an ailing body, no one can be sure what an assistant is doing. I've been watching him because he's been watching you. Whatever it is was intended for you, Shin. He's one of Lick's men. I suppose he figured that since Lick is gone, he could use his poison on an even more important target. Shin was dumbfounded, and the urge to vomit overwhelmed him again. Somehow he managed to ask, Captain, who shot Thorn? The arrow came from our side. Yes, it did, Milt said, eyeing the skirmish, still searching. And if it wasn't for the other side misjudging their shot, this wouldn't be so sloppy right now. He waved in frustration at the battle. And it's called a bolt, not an arrow. Shin stared at him. Where'd it come from? New weapon, said Nelt distractedly. Called a crossbow. Can make them very small and compact, ideal for concealing. The man you kicked, he had 2 inside his jacket. You caused him to fire the second prematurely, and I think it hit Glasser. It did, Shin said, but he should be all right. I saw him take a hit to the shoulder. Shoulder? Nelt asked, glancing at him for the first time. He'll be dead soon. Why? It was just his shoulder. The bolt's tip was poisoned, Nelt said, surprisingly cool and focused on the shouts and screams and bodies falling at the border. If the bolt penetrates the muscle, the poison travels to paralyze the whole body. That's what hit Sargon, too. He still would have died, but it would have taken another half hour or more. He would have drifted quietly to death while being attended to, no one realizing what danger he was in. But instead we have this full-scale battle on our hands. It was stupid to send you to the other side. He spat as if it were Shin's fault. Changed everything. Shifted all the angles. It's almost as if Thorn suspected... Nelt shook his head in frustration. I always hated playing dices. We can't afford this. Not right now. Shin stared at Captain Nelt, feeling as if he were drowning. Sir, how'd you know the bolt was poisoned? That it works like that? I listen, Shin, Nelt said, not taking his eyes off the battle. I pay attention. Didn't I tell you to do the same thing? Thorn! Shin suddenly remembered. General Thorn was struck as well. Sir, will he be all right? Nelt finally turned to him. You sound like you really care. He claims you as his son and the very next moment hands you over to his greatest enemy. And you're worried what happens to him? Not really sure how he felt about Thorn, Shin asked meekly. Will he die? Nelt scoffed. Not unless we're lucky. The slagging surgeon pulled out the bolt too quickly. He turned back to the battle. Thorn probably wore his body shield anyway. I doubt it even penetrated his skin. He cried out in pain just for show. Body shield? Thick cowhide. It covers him like a large vest. He usually wears it to battle under his uniform, and he had it on today, I'm sure. That's why he needed to be hit in the arm, not the back, he added bitterly. What do we do now? Shin said, his attention on the fighting, but feeling uneasy next to a man who he initially thought was his help, but was turning out to be something else entirely. We sit back and wait, Corporal. We see who prevails. Then we align ourselves with whomever gives us the best chance at survival. Nelt stopped short and began to slide off his horse. Captain? Captain! Shin fell off his horse to catch Nelt, who was crumpling to the ground. A long arrow was protruding from his chest. Captain, no! Shin broke off the shaft and tore open Nelt's jacket to get the rest of the arrow. It had penetrated deeply into Nelt's chest. Sir, hold on, I can do this. "Shin," Nelt whispered as his eyes closed. "Gonna miss you," was all he could say before his ragged breathing stopped. "Captain Nelt! Sir, please, no!" It was no use. Nelt was dead, the arrow anchored into his heart. Shin sat on the ground next to him, too shocked to shed any tears. Something partially concealed under Nelt's open jacket caught his eye. He lifted the jacket and stared at the odd object. It looked to be a small bow with a mechanism that released short arrows. A bag of bolts hung from the inside of the jacket, along with a small, dark vial. And that's the end of that chapter.